wieczór, dámy i gospoda. I'd like to thank you very warmly for your invitation to speak at this distinguished university. The last time I was in your city was in 1966 as a student in Cambridge, and it is such a delight to be welcomed so warmly by such a distinguished gathering. I was also very encouraged by the introductory speech of Professor Tobic in his quotation about the relationship of metaphysical speculation to science. And it gives me the opportunity to begin by pointing out that for the most part, the activities in which scientists engage do not involve metaphysical speculation. When biologists are trying to discover how a particular part of the body fits in, they're not thinking of some kind of great overarching worldview. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, you are here tonight because science is used today increasingly to fuel certain metaphysical speculations. And it is that area which I shall address. But I do not wish to lose that sense of proportion. I know that most of science has got nothing to do with the topics that we shall be addressing tonight. Now, the common impression in Western Europe at least is that, and in Eastern Europe, is that there somehow is a warfare going on with science on the one side and belief in God on the other side. There are very loud and powerful voices proclaiming that, notably my colleague Richard Dawkins in Oxford, and more recently Professor Stephen Hawking at Cambridge. And many young people, and indeed older people, feel that they've got to choose between science and God. The reason that's given is that it is possible to deduce from scientific research a metaphysical worldview of atheism. So they are claiming that, to start with. And it's that I wish to analyze with you this evening. So let's first demonstrate that the simplistic idea that science is locked in essential conflict with belief in God is clearly false. The Higgs boson was discovered recently, and all Scots people are delighted that Peter Higgs has been awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. He is an atheist. He does not like his particle being called the God particle. I don't like it either, and I'm not an atheist. I think he's right. A few years ago, William Phillips won the Nobel Prize for Physics, the very same prize. William Phillips is a Christian. Peter Higgs is an atheist. What does that demonstrate? It demonstrates, ladies and gentlemen, very simply, that it cannot be that science and belief in God are in an essential conflict, because Peter Higgs and William Phillips do not differ in their science. They're studying the same science. They believe the same physics. Where they differ is at the level of their worldview. One is an atheist and the other is a theist, a Christian. So my first point is this. There is a conflict, but it's not between science and religion. It is between two worldviews. The worldview of materialism or naturalism, which is atheistic, and the worldview of theism. It's a very ancient conflict. And you know what's so interesting about this is, firstly, everyone in this room has a worldview. As you quoted, sir, in your introduction, people do have very different ideas, even if they're scientists, about where their science fits into the bigger picture. And I've always been interested in that, ladies and gentlemen. And perhaps I should explain to you a little bit of where I'm coming from. I'm not coming from England. I'm coming from Northern Ireland. You may have heard of it. It's a country much smaller than yours. And it's a country that hasn't got the best reputation when it comes to religion. Because I grew up with two factions fighting, both claiming to be Christian. My parents were very unusual. They were Christian without being sectarian. In fact, my father had a small business, and he employed equally Protestants and Catholics. He suffered for it. We were bombed several times, and my brother was nearly killed. I know about religious violence, ladies and gentlemen. But my parents demonstrated to me that faith in God had nothing to do with that. Secondly, they allowed me to think. That was very unusual in my country, because there was very dogmatic thinking on each side of the divide, which of course led to much of the problem. So that's my background. So it amazes many people that I believe in God at all. And you may want to ask me about that. But that's a little bit about my background. So when I arrived in Cambridge in 1962, not 1862, 1962, I was confronted with a very new world. What an opportunity it was. The first in my family to go to university. And in my first week, a student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I really am sorry. You're Irish. I forgot." All you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it. Now, of course, I'd heard that before. I was well aware of the Freudian explanation of my belief system. You may want to question me about Sigmund Freud later. That's fine. But he really made me think. He changed my life, actually. Because I decided on that day that what I needed to do was to go and make friends with an atheist and an agnostic and a person from different religions. And I spent my entire life doing it. I learned German. That enabled me to go in those days to countries around here where I could meet, particularly in the German Democratic Republic, and talk to people and investigate the effects of atheism as a cultural phenomenon. And then I became a Russian translator, as one does in mathematics. And when, in 1989, the wall fell, I went to Siberia, fortunately on a two-way ticket. And I spent a while in Siberia, and it was fascinating, in the Academy of Sciences. Because when they discovered I believed in God, they would even ask me about God in mathematics seminars. I'd never come across this before. And I spent several months at different times in various parts of Russia debating these things with members of the Academy of Sciences. Why? Because I'm searching for truth. And I'm interested in discovering exactly what other people believe and why they believe it. Now, the very interesting thing to my mind is this, that the contemporary situation, certainly in my country, is that science has buried God, and people just don't realize it yet. That's very odd. Why is it odd? Well, let's look at a bit of the evidence from history. Where did modern science come from? Notice the word modern. Not talking about ancient Greek science, not talking about the Islamic transmission of that into Europe. I'm talking about modern science. 16th, 17th century. Explosion in Europe in a monotheistic culture. That's very interesting to historians and philosophers of science. Is there any connection between the worldview of theism and the scientific method? The answer from most of my colleagues and many scholars is yes, there is. C.S. Lewis was summarizing on one occasion the work of Sir Alfred North Whitehead, and he wrote, "Men became scientific because they expected laws in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver." So in the 16th and 17th century, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and coming on up to Clerk Maxwell and Babbage, they were all believers in God. Isn't it very odd now that we're being asked to choose between science and God, when belief in God was the motor that drove the rise of science originally? That I find extremely interesting and extremely odd. Hawking tells me it's science or God. Newton tells me it's science and God, and they both occupy the same chair in Cambridge. Very interesting, isn't it? So let's do a little bit of investigation. Now, I was going to tell you that this business of worldviews, we all have a worldview. We all have our own approach to the big questions, the worldview questions. What is ultimate reality? How do I know anything? What is the nature of truth? Where do we get meaning from? What is the status of the universe? What is the status of human life? And so on. And you would think, in a way, that there are as many answers to those questions as there are people. In a sense, that's true. But in another sense, there is a very limited family of possibilities. In the ancient Greek world, we had the brilliant atomists, Democritus, Leucippus, who had the phenomenal idea of the atomos, something that could not be cut. We know it can be cut, and I suspect there are people in the front row who have cut it and know all about its little bits. But the idea was brilliant. Now, they believed that ultimate reality consisted of two things. One, the atoms. Two, empty space. So their concept of explanation was everything is explicable bottom up in terms of what we would now call mass energy and space. Yes, they were the materialists. At the same time, we had Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and they said, yes, there is a physical universe, but there is more to it than that. There is transcendence. There are the gods. And one of them, Xenophanes, interestingly, for an ancient Greek, says there's only one God. The other gods are Greek imagination. There is one God. So these two views from the ancient world are to be found in every academy, including mine. There is another family. Notice I use the word family. There are many variations on the theme within these different worldviews. There's a third one, and that is the pantheistic worldview, that says there is a God, but God is essentially nature, and it is impersonal. So within those three, plus if you like to add skepticism, postmodern relativism, that accounts for the vast majority of people's ideas. And what I want to suggest to you is, what's the current debate about? It's this, that people like Richard Dawkins, who are influential, claim that you can deduce the naturalistic, atheistic worldview from science. You can get the metaphysics out of the science. Can you? Well, I want to think a little bit about that. Because people like me would claim the exact opposite. That science is not neutral. It does not actually point towards atheism, but it points towards theism. So you can see Richard Dawkins and I disagree. So let's have a look The first evidence I called was the evidence of history, which provides the contrast with today. And it raises the question in the sharpest form. Now, I suppose one of the first things that's said is that God is a delusion. That's obvious in Sigmund Freud. Like Santa Claus. Do you have Santa Claus here? Or St. Nicholas or something like that? You know what I mean, yes? Like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, or if you're Irish, leprechauns, little fairies at the bottom of your garden. So that's the idea. Well, I'm not so sure, really. I haven't ever met an adult who came to believe in Santa Claus. I've met many who stopped believing in Santa Claus. I did, very young. I discovered that Santa Claus was my parents, and I was just about to reveal it when I stopped. I discovered it had great financial advantage to keep the secret. No, it's not like that. And I mentioned Freud earlier. This idea that God is an illusion is a double-edged sword. Manfred Lutz, a brilliant German psychiatrist, has just written a book about it called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the great one, in which he says, if there is no God, Freud gives you a brilliant argument why all religion is an illusion. A wish fulfillment, a father in the sky, if there is no God. Of course, he says, if there is a God. Freud gives you an equally brilliant argument why atheism is an illusion. A projection of the desire never having to have to meet God. And then he draws his bottom line. On the question whether there is a God or not, Freud can't help you at all. And I think we need to be aware that that argument works both ways. And indeed, Stephen Hawking was interviewed not long ago, it just falls into my mind, and was asked what he thought about religion. Oh, he said, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And the London Times came to me and asked me to give a reply of the same length. Oh, I said, that's easy. Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, you laugh, ladies and gentlemen, but that proves nothing. If you think seriously about my Freudian argument, it's easy to give one-liners, but the business lies much deeper than that. So why come back to my main question, why are we offered today by leading scientists up to the highest level this choice between God and science? Well, firstly, it arises from a confusion about the nature of God. That may surprise you. I used to think in my naivety that when I spoke about God, everybody knew what I meant. I now discover that is not the case. Because many of my scientific colleagues think that my God is a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Like the ancient Greeks thought that lightning and thunder expressed the anger of the gods. But do a little bit of atmospheric physics, please, at the University of Belgrade, and you'll soon discover it's got nothing to do with the anger of the gods. It's got to do with electrical discharges, variations in atmospheric pressure, and so on. Exit the gods. So that's one gap filled. And many people think of God like that. Here's a bit of biology. I can't explain it yet scientifically, so God did that. And of course, a bit more science, and God disappears. Now, the logic of that is very interesting. It's this. If you define God to be a God of the gaps, then you've got to choose between God and science. I would. Because you're defining God that way. And you see, that's where half the problem comes from. The God they don't believe in, as I pointed out to Richard Dawkins, is the God I don't believe in either. I've never met a serious monotheist who believes in a God of the gaps. I believe in a God who's God of the whole show. He's the author of the bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. And therefore he doesn't disappear with the advance in science. Indeed, that would be a very curious argument. I'm not an expert in art. I wish I were. If I go in and look at a Rubens painting, well, I can see it's beautiful. But if you studied art, you can tell me much more about the genius of Rubens than I can see, because you know more about art, not because you know less. The more you know about engineering, the more you can admire a Rolls-Royce engine, not the less. And so the more Isaac Newton and Kepler discovered about the universe, the more they admired the genius of the God that had done it that way, which is why when Newton wrote Principia Mathematica, he expressed the hope that it would lead people to believe in a God. Now this is extremely important, it seems to be. This God of the gaps thinking is false, but there's something else that's false. And that has to do with science now and the nature of explanation. We are very used to the idea that science explains. I remember when I first came across Newton's laws of motion at school, and when I was shown how to derive the elliptical motions of the planets from, I thought this was spectacular. From an equation with 8 symbols in it, you could derive all these observations that Kepler made and Tycho Brahe and so on. That was spectacular to me. How did it work? I didn't know that I was asking the same thing as Einstein, who said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. What a fascinating thing it is to discover that. But I made a mistake. I thought that the law told me what gravity was. It doesn't. In fact, nobody knows what gravity is. I wasn't told that at school. You see, scientific explanation is actually limited. And Newton realized that. Non fingo hypothesi. I don't make hypotheses. He knew that his laws didn't explain gravity. It enables you to do brilliant calculations and even land a person on the moon, but it doesn't tell you what gravity or energy are. So that was very important to me. The second thing that was important was to realize that science is not the only way to truth. That's obvious in this university, because you don't only have faculties of science, do you? You have history, you have architecture, you have art, you have languages, linguistics, philosophy, and everything else. If science was the only way to truth, you'd have to close them all tomorrow. But thankfully, we do not believe that science is the only way to truth. It was Bertrand Russell, actually, who said that what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. I have great respect for Russell as a logician and as a historian of science, but his logic disappeared when he made that statement. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Is that a statement of science? No. So it's true, it's false. You cannot know it. It's logically incoherent, as Sir Peter Medawar, another Nobel Prize winner, observed, when he said we do science a disservice when we think it can answer every question. It can't even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? You need to go to literature and art and theology and philosophy to get answers to those questions. Einstein saw it too. He once put it brilliantly. You can talk about the ethical foundations of science. He said you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. That is, that science cannot comment on ethics. Now, I know there's a huge debate about that, and I'm interested in it, but I'm not going to be diverted to it. Because I'm going to just point out that one of the problems that I meet is a misconception about scientific explanation. It's slightly different from what I've just mentioned. It's this. Here's the crude version of the argument. We used to think the gods were responsible for this. We've now discovered a law and a mechanism, so we don't need God. Stephen Hawking put it exactly like that. There's no room in physics for God. What exactly that means is a very curious thing, as we shall see in a moment. But there's a confusion behind that statement. You don't find Henry Ford in a car engine, do you? Now, if we had a Ford car engine sitting here, and I asked you to explain it, you might say to me, well, I can explain it in terms of engineering and the law of internal combustion. Somebody else might say, but just a moment, I can explain it by mentioning Henry Ford. Well, should we choose between those two explanations? And you say, that's absurd. If you want a holistic description of the engine, you need two kinds of explanation. One is in terms of mechanism and law. The other is in terms of agency. Now, it is obvious, isn't it, that the explanation in terms of law and mechanism does not conflict or compete with the explanation in terms of an agent. They complement each other. Let me put it another way. The existence of a mechanism or a law that explains something scientifically is not in itself an argument for the non-existence of an agent who designed either that mechanism or that law. And yet we're told it is. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion. As my colleague at Oxford, Professor of Philosophy, Richard Swinburne, used to say, science explains. I believe that science explains. I postulate God to explain why science explains. So that the two can go together as they did at the beginning. So I want to suggest to you that there's deep, deep confusion riding at the heart of the contemporary debate. And it would be a good thing to have open discussion about it. Now, one of the major arguments that now comes, and I've met it several times already on this brief tour from Austria down to you here. I'm asked it every time, so I'll save it being asked in the questions. I'll ask myself it now. And that is, if you postulate God as creator and upholder of the universe, that does not help us at all, because you see, logically, you then have to ask the question, who created the creator? And then, of course, you have to go on and ask who created the creator that created the creator that created the creator that created the creator. And the thing comes absurd, so you forget it and you discuss football. It's much more interesting. It sounds brilliant, doesn't it? It's very interesting to analyze it logically. Let me abstract the essence of it. Who or what created X? Well, we understand the question. But notice that this question is a clever question. I come from Ireland, and the Irish love making jokes and all this kind of thing. And one of the famous questions was asked by a judge to a man, and he said, "When did you stop beating your wife?" Now, that's an interesting question. How do you answer that, ladies and gentlemen? If I were to ask you that, you gentlemen, tonight, I think you'd be reluctant to say anything. Because, you see, the question contains an assumption that you've started beating your wife. And similarly, the question, who created the creator, contains the assumption that the creator was created. But what if he wasn't? The question does not apply. Philosophers call this a complex question because it closes down the options and people don't notice it. It's a very interesting question. You see, from my perspective as a Christian, and from my friends' perspective who are Muslims or Jews, they do not believe in a created creator. In fact, neither does Dawkins, of course. Created gods are simply idols. So the question simply doesn't apply. But it does apply to created gods. So let's have a go again. As I pointed out to Richard Dawkins in one of our debates, I said, Richard, you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your question, since you think it's valid. Who created your creator? I've been waiting 7 years for an answer to that question. It's deeper than that. Because really what the question is about is ultimate reality. Do the questions go back infinitely backwards, or do they stop? And what I notice for most people is that they stop very quickly. For my atheist friends, they usually stop. I was talking to someone just last week in Oxford, and he said, I stop with the universe. That's a brute fact. And I said, I stop with God. So the issue between us is not, is there an ultimate reality? The issue is, which reality is ultimate? So that balances the equation up. And of course, we have to ask ourselves about evidence for it. Now, what contemporary science has led us to is a very interesting situation. We are now in the information age. And there's a great irony here. Because many physicists, not all, are coming to the conclusion that information is not a physical quantity. In spite of the work of Rolf Landauer, which has recently had a big revision by a professor in Oxford, information is physical. It isn't. It's non-material. Information is carried on material, but it itself is not material. And the irony of that, to my mind, is this, that there's been such a dominance of reductionism in the 20th century, and yet scientific research has now brought information into the very center of things. And I want to just talk briefly about that and open it to you for questions in a moment by talking just a little bit about what is going on. There's a related question or objection to Dawkins' who created the creator. It's more sophisticated. It's this. If you postulate God as creator, this is absurd. Why? Because by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. So that's not an explanation at all. Now, this again, you will notice, is a question about the nature of explanation. Does explanation always, even in science, proceed from the simple to the complex? It often does. Most of us who are scientists believe in methodological reductionism. And since it's late at night and we're all tired, let me illustrate it by a story. I'm honoured to belong as a fellow to an Oxford college, and we have dinners every Thursday night by candlelight. It's very nice. The only problem is you cannot choose where you sit. So you sometimes run into difficulty. And one night I discovered I was sitting beside one of our guests who was a very distinguished biochemist who ran the department, actually. And he asked me, which was a fatal mistake, he asked me what I did. I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh, he said, how boring. And he meant it. So I didn't really know what to do because this was a very bad start for the evening. I said, you know, I realize that mathematics isn't the most sociable of subjects. In fact, it's very recondite and complex. But, you know, I do try to make up for it by being interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? So I said, well, I'm interested in the status of the universe, for instance. Is it created or not? I'm also interested in the status of human life. Is it made in the image of God or not? He said, stop, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we have nothing to talk about, we are going to have a most miserable evening. Well, that was a challenge, wasn't it? So I said to him, I did what I normally do when I panic, I smiled, and I said, no, we're going to have a marvellous discussion. Do you know, you're a reductionist, so am I. I am very interested in reductionism. In fact, I know 3 kinds of reductionism. Which kind are you? I said, I suppose you're a methodological reductionist. You take a big problem, you split it into little problems, you get insight on the little problems, and you draw a conclusion for the whole thing. He said, exactly, that's what we do. That's what I do, I said. I said, at least we can start there. But he said, there's another kind. I said, yes, there is. There are 2 other kinds. There's an epistemological reductionist and there's an ontological one. And I suspect you're an ontological one. You believe that everything can ultimately be reduced to physics and chemistry. Now, there we're back to the Greek materialist philosophy. He said, exactly. That's what I believe. So I said, can we then do an experiment? He said, what? At the dinner table? I said, yes, this is Oxford. Why not do an experiment here? So I picked up the menu and showed it to him. On it, it said, roast chicken. Not very elegant. It wasn't even written in French. So it said roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, let me get it clear. You're a reductionist. Everything physics and chemistry. He said, absolutely. So I said, well, have a look at this. R-O-A-S-T. I need to be careful how I write my letters. Yesterday I was in Zagreb and I wrote God in Cyrillic letters, which apparently was a mistake, but there we are. And the very first question of the evening was this: did you not know that we don't use Cyrillic letters? And I answered, I know now. So anyway, roast chicken, R-O-A-S-T. He said, what's the problem? Well, I said, these signs have a semiotic dimension when they're put together. R-O-A-S-T. You ascribe meaning to that. He said, I do. Well, I said, okay, you're a reductionist. Please explain to me the semiotic dimension in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. His wife was sitting beside him. And a little bit too loudly, she said, get out of that if you can. He didn't try. He said something that stunned me. He said, you know, John, he was getting friendly now, for 40 years I've believed that could be done. Every day I've gone into the laboratory in Oxford thinking that could be done, but it cannot be done. I was so shocked. I didn't know what to do. I said, but just a minute. I played devil's advocate. And I said, look, physics and chemistry have only been operating seriously for 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. The explanatory power of physics and chemistry cannot account for the meaning in that word. Only an intelligence can. An intelligence of the gaps, or an intelligence that's postulated as a result of the nature of the situation. And he looked at me for a long time and he said, where did you get that argument? I said, I confess it. I didn't think of it. I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. Oh, he said, what a relief. And he was very friendly and honest about it. But it's very interesting, ladies and gentlemen. The moment you see roast chicken, your mind works, and what happens, there's a perception. It's not a proof, it's a perception. That you don't infer downwards to chance and necessity. You refer upwards to an intelligence, even though there may be many automatic processes that have gone to construct that menu. You don't know how many processes are automatic and blind, but what you do know is because you're presented with text, intelligence has been involved at some level. I'm not a biologist, ladies and gentlemen, but I have many friends and I read a lot of biology. And they tell me about the DNA code. The longest word we've ever discovered, 3.5 billion letters long. 4-letter alphabet, a chemical alphabet consisting of codons, because they code because the structure of the word tells us about the proteins and their folding and everything else. And I say to my colleagues, tell me about that. What is ultimately involved? Oh, they say only two things, chance and necessity. I say, pardon? You mean chance and the laws of nature? Yes, of course. But I say, just a moment. You see 5 letters, roast, and you immediately infer intelligence. Why don't you do that when you see the longest word we've ever discovered? That puzzles me, ladies and gentlemen. It puzzles me especially as we move on into theoretical computer science. Because you see, the origin of life, peace be to Richard Dawkins, is as big a mystery as it was in 1953 when they thought they'd solved the problem. And for years, Dawkins and others have told us that the Darwinian theory of evolution explains the origin of life, which is logical nonsense, as Dawkins now admits. You cannot explain the existence of a mutating replicator by evolution, because you need the mutating replicator to start with. What are we going to say about life and its origin of this code? Now, I'm not going to take you down one of my interests, which is the whole question of the simulation of the cell by a machine. Because the language is used, isn't it, in computer science, that the cell computes. So at that level, it's an information processor. It's vastly more. But if it's simply that, then one would argue that it can be simulated by a Turing machine. And then we come to the wonderful work of Johann von Neumann and Norbert Wiener and a lot of other people who suggest to us that machines can process information, but they cannot generate it. So it seems to me now we're not making an inference from gaps, but the very science is pointing towards the necessity of an intelligent input. So that is just one stream in the argument. It is by far not the only stream. Ladies and gentlemen, thinking of these two worldviews, the principal ones that dominate the academy, the atheistic one in Oxford certainly is by far the more dominant. It starts with, in the beginning, were the particles, or mass energy, or a quantum vacuum, or something like that. And that mind, life, consciousness, mind are derivative. And the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview is diametrically opposed to it. It goes like this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. So that here mind, the Word, Logos, God is primary, and mass energy and everything else is derivative. And it's not just as a Christian, but mainly as a scientist, that the explanation in terms of the Word at the beginning makes infinitely more sense to me. Ladies and gentlemen, this is enough, I think, to stimulate some questions. Now, the talk is entitled, Has Science Buried God? Science in various languages can be interpreted variously. There are the natural sciences. And I understand that your word for science includes more than the natural sciences, all knowledge, disciplined knowledge, so that it includes history, it includes languages and all the rest of it. I mention that for the following reason. I have restricted myself to the natural sciences, but I have a colleague with me who is an ancient historian, Dr. Jürgen Spiess, from Germany. And I'm going to invite him to come up and join me so that there'll be both a natural sciences person and a humanities person answering the questions. Dr. Spiess is an expert on Dostoevsky. He has already lectured to several hundred students this afternoon here in the philosophy faculty. He is also, as an ancient historian, he has gone into great detail in how an ancient historian would approach some of the central claims of Christianity, which I have mentioned, of course, like the resurrection of Jesus. So if you'll come up, Dr. Spiess, here and sit with me, then if you have questions and you're about to be given the opportunity to do it,